Hello and welcome to Populi. Populi is an alternative media platform dedicated to looking at all things digital from a social justice and global south perspective. We're now also a podcast. I'm your host, Tanvi Kanchan, and this is episode 4 of the Davos Diaries. In the final episode of this mini-series, we'll hear from our guests on what strategies civil society needs to explore to counter the corporate capture of global governance, and how the multilateral system can be reclaimed. We'll also hear from our guests on what their message is to Davos 2021. When it comes to challenging spaces like the World Economic Forum, Barbara Adams points out that it's not Davos or the notion of public-private partnership that is the issue, but more structural problems such as the size and power of large corporations and the position of primacy they enjoy on a global level. In order to effectively counter their influence, we should look at Davos as symptomatic of a larger issue, rather than as a unique phenomenon.
I think the first thing is, the World Economic Forum describes itself as an international organization for public-private cooperation. I'm not against public-private cooperation, but I am against public-private cooperation being the only way in which we can go about it. I think that global governance, I think the first thing we have to do is to get a lot sharper about what's actually on the global agenda and to make sure that what's on the global agenda is not undermining what people are achieving in their local communities and is not top-down regulating and reducing the political space. The issue is not to be against for-profit per se from my point of view. The issue is size. The issue is control. The issue is that it happens in such a way that people's rights are undermined. I'm pretty sure that if Davos didn't exist, there'd be another space. Because it's not Davos, it's the network. And that happens to be where now we have this symbol of it. But it's not like they wait once a year to decide whether or not they're going to do any of this, right? But I think for organizing purposes, symbols like that are very important. But I think if we then go down the track of assuming that if we could stop Davos or we could invade Davos, we'd change anything, I don't believe that for 1 second.
Jim Thomas notes that the United Nations is the closest thing that we have to a democratic body for international governance, and believes that we should look to improving such multilateral spaces to better allow for meaningful participation from social movements and civil society.
The important question there is then, how do you build legitimate global governance that listens to social movements of millions and billions of people, and that has a sort of democratic mandate? And the closest thing we have to that is the United Nations, which has been around for 75 years, works through a system of states and one member, one vote. And in some places, the United Nations system has innovated spaces for civil society, for social movements, for farmers, and so forth, to have a genuine voice, for indigenous people to have spaces to bring forward indigenous sovereignty outside of the notion of states. That has been innovated over 75 years. And what's significant right now, particularly with the World Economic Forum, is that there is an attempt to break that apart. I think that's what's going on. This is a 75-year institution that in some areas is trending towards more responsive, inclusive, democratic structures. And at exactly the moment where that's happening, you have things like the Food Systems Summit as an attempt to shift towards a Davos multi-stakeholder agenda. So what can civil society and social movements do? We can defend the UN when it does it right, but also point out when it does it wrong. We can insist on the legitimacy of social movement organized structures, whether in national context or international context. It's interesting, for many years, the counterpoint to the World Economic Forum was the World Social Forum. It was the coming together of movements in an attempt to show a different world. And maybe this is a moment where the World Social Forum needs to reassert itself, or something like that.
Parminder Jeet Singh, Executive Director of IT for Change and a founding member of the JustNet Coalition, has been working on issues of internet and data governance for several years and provides insight into crucial organizing strategies for civil society in the digital sphere. He points out that when it comes to the internet, civil society needs to reflect on its own role in pushing digital governance into private hands, such as through their support for the Net Mondial initiative, of which the WEF was a key organizer. He expands further on why it's more important than ever before for global digital governance to move to democratic spaces.
While there is perhaps some knowledge generally about corporate capture of global governance, which is happening in all areas. But what I want to specifically speak about and emphasize is that in the area of digital governance, it is especially pernicious, especially acute, and very far-reaching. So what can civil society do is to, first of all, take a self-assessment of tech is not what it used to be in the late 1990s, when it was a radical phenomenon against the powers that be, in which they cooperated with the digital startups to develop the internet as a kind of a counterpower. It is no longer a counterpower. It is the entrenched power. The internet today, as you call that artifact, and the systems around it, is itself the means of power for economic actors like big global corporations and state actors, as we know. And therefore, our attitude to its governance needs to change. It is important for civil society to, for example, make allies with civil society groups which are involved on economic issues. Today, it's very surprising, but if you say digital rights, it means for most people just privacy and security, almost for all people, and not the economic rights of small farmers, traders, Uber drivers, and people in general who are facing the issues vis-a-vis large global platforms. So we need to anchor the economic rights discourse. Second, we need to take support from big actors who are on the wrong side of the economic drive. And it's always happened at global levels that we always found allies in states or countries which would help a more democratic global governance of a phenomenon. In this regard, it is the US and China who are becoming global superpowers in the digital area. Other countries, especially developing countries, and partly also Europe, should be more eager to have democratic global governance and find allies in these governments to develop fronts. So I've said two things. One, develop economic agendas and include a bigger swath of traditional civil society and take that group along. And second, make allies with governments who are on the right side of asking for more democratic governance of the digital. So these are the two issues that civil society should be doing in the digital area today.
Harris Gleckman believes that amongst other strategies, one way for civil society to counter corporate multi-stakeholderism is by exerting pressure on governments to make sure that such corporations are pushed out of international governance spaces where they have a conflict of interest.
At a national level, there are no seats for corporations in national parliaments. There are no seats for corporations on key government health and safety bodies. They've managed to create the appearance that they should have that space for the international market. So once part of that is for civil society and developing countries to say, no, you have a conflict of interest in this subject, then leave. Now that would still allow some corporations to take part, but not those in that sector. At the same time, as civil society organizations could be pushing their governments at home to engage in work like that around a binding treaty on TNCs and other enterprises and human rights, to set the rules under a human rights umbrella for how multinationals should operate across borders. So there's lots of spaces and urgent spaces for civil society to engage in responding to Davos.
Roberto Bissio notes that the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the established processes of the multilateral system, and that civil society needs to strongly shape the coming form of global governance in the interests of people and the planet, with a focus on what our needs are locally.
Now, what new form it will take, it's impossible to predict, among other things, because it will depend what people on the streets are pressing and demanding from their governments to do multilaterally as a mirror of what they're being requested to do nationally. And nationally, in many places, interesting things are happening. For example, in several Latin American countries, on the one hand, the internet is being declared as a public good, so that even if the providers are private, people have a right to access that has to be guaranteed by the governments. That's a major step in the conceptualization. At the same time that in other countries, and in some cases the same countries, care is being revisited as a key activity and a human right. And if care becomes a right to be cared, then the caregiving, which is done by women and which is done free or at very little payment and so on, has to be a co-responsibility of the state. Now that's, again, a paradigm shift that is coming and which is not coming out of the traditional centers of power, but is being imposed in practice by the women movements and by the popular movements in the streets. And I see a lot of hope coming from that.
Parminder questions the lack of a democratic multilateral body for digital governance when one exists for almost all other sectors. He points to the mandate for such a body in the World Summit on Information Society, held in 2003 and 2005, which has never been fulfilled due to opposition from the US and its allies. He believes civil society should push for a realization of such a space.
If there is a WHO which is needed for global health governance, education governance is with UNESCO, and practically every area has a UN body devoted to it. How is it possible then, when digital is so important an area, as well it is perhaps more global than any other area, does not have any global democratic space for its governance? There would always be a problem. I'm not minimizing the issue of states getting together and trying to develop, technical standards or other kind of policy norms which increase their power vis-a-vis states. And authoritarian digital state is a big problem. But those kind of fights have to be fought when we face them. That happens with issues of education, which happens with the development policy in general, which UNDP may bring up. It happens in many areas where the civil societies have fought with the wrong kind of policies governments make and supported the right kind of policies. But this is no argument against having a globally democratic governance space at all. It is a very dangerous situation we are in now, when we are having US and China who are developing their spheres of influence. And as the new IMF chief recently said, a digital Berlin Wall is developing between these two poles, and the countries are having to choose to either be on the US technical side or be digitally with China. That's very dangerous unless you have a global democratic place where these countries who do not want to, give up their independence, their self-determination by linking to the digital value chains, either of the US or China in a very debilitating way, without any global governance. We need to get these countries together. And there is a huge number of countries, and this includes Europe, incidentally, where there is a lot of fear of these two US and China superpowers making their spheres of influence, and to have something more democratic.
Chee Yoke Ling urges civil society to keep itself abreast of the ideas and networks that are being formulated in spaces like Davos, in order to better monitor and counter the inroads made by transnational corporations into global governance. The real fight, she believes, must be waged in the details.
So we have to, I think a big challenge for us in civil society is that we have to do our homework on the intellectual side. We have to even if I hate looking at the website of some of these people, I have to go in there and look what they're thinking about, because by the time I see the website, it's a bit late actually, right? So we need to do intelligence gathering. We need to pull, and there are people in civil society and some really, and I'll call them the real think tanks, activist think tanks who are monitoring. The people who are monitoring, following the money. The people who are monitoring companies, technologies, you name it. And the people who are how to monitor our work that we do in our, for example, we know that our experience and way we can add value to the activism and the real transformation is, for example, in the trade agreements, right? In the economic, I wouldn't even call them trade, they're no longer about trade. Every agreement with 20 chapters is not about goods anymore, right? So we then go into the details, because the details is where you're going to fight them. Otherwise, you can make general statements and say, thank you very much, here's your memo, goodbye. Or we even have consultations, whether it's at the global level or at the national level, we all meet, we can come and give a memo. Thank you very much, we've heard you, and then we go on and do basically the same thing. We have to change the terms of engagement. We will be at the table when we are really prepared, and then we fight for access to information. We have to do our homework. So for me, that's very important.
Renata Avila is of the view that governments can be civil society's greatest allies in taming big tech, and that civil society can and should strategically use spaces like the WEF as a free intelligence service of sorts.
I think that we have the narrative, the not so good narrative that the government is bad, the government is bad, the government is bad, that we heard the first decade and a half of the century. Oh, government censor, government is stupid, the government doesn't understand the technology. That has to stop. Because actually governments, and I know that many anarchists will be like completely in disagreement with me, I don't care. Governments are the only ones taming big tech. And of course, we need to choose the less of two evils, a government or a corporation, and still a government we can vote out. A corporation we cannot vote out, and that's part of the strategy. And part of the strategy is to keep our ears and eyes open to what's going on in this fora. No, it's not all black and white. There's lots of nuances in all this sphere. Like from 700 experts, of course, some good will come out from. And use them as an intelligence services, basically for free, provided to us. We have the advantage that unlike the ban on meetings, Davos meetings, most of the things are published. Many of the things are accessible to anyone, to everyone. And we can use them as strategic assets to shape as well our strategies and to understand what the other side is thinking and find points in common. If we're invited, I think that the invitations shouldn't be declined. I think that we need to go and learn and take advantage of the access that these invitations offer, and understand, fear it and demonize it less, and understand it and use all their assets to our advantage. I think that would be my advice. And last but not least, be very critical and advocate for a reform on these topics at the UN level, because it's a mess, and it's a mess. It's full of holes, full of spaces where nasty forces are infiltrating, and the UN is too precious to be lost. So we need to fight to repurpose it, and so to serve the 21st century purposes.
Parminder further emphasizes that digital issues are transversal. He expands on how the JustNet Coalition is working towards addressing this cross-cutting nature of digital issues by bringing together civil society groups from different constituencies to examine how the digital affects their work.
The issue of digital policy should now move also away from just cross-cutting some digital activists to be located within different sectors. It's for an agriculture organization to see how digital impacts agriculture, for a health organization to see how digital impacts health, for an education organization, for a governance, a media organization similarly. And all of them should be incapacitated to develop their own digital view. And then these digital views get put together and a cross-cutting digital view is developed. Right now, this doesn't happen. We have been trying to take some practical steps in this direction. We are trying to develop a more distributed form of digital policy perspective development through perhaps what would be sector-specific nodes held by different organizations in JustNet coalition who will anchor health-related digital policy perspectives, education-related policy perspectives, agriculture-related policy perspectives, and then pull this all together. So these are the few directions in which JustNet coalition should go and is planning to go.
As we come to the close of this mini-series, let's hear from each of our guests on what their message is to Davos 2021.
My message mostly is addressed to the civil society participants, to the academic participants, to the government participants, and to the other specialists that they bring on board. There's an awful lot of good work that all of those groups can do, should do, but not sharing those ideas in a confined space around Davos, but to share them and participate in a much broader process outside of Davos. There is no problem that I have with firms meeting each other to think about big issues. There's a question of anti-competitiveness on a global scale, yes. But my primary focus at the moment is that civil society, academics, and governments should not be contributing to that process, but should be contributing to a broader effort at effective global governance within their own areas.
While you do represent the most powerful forces, people in the world, and that's a problem from my viewpoint, to have discursive power in hands of the most powerful people, which is what Davos represents. But still, I have to speak to you. My message is don't get too greedy, because if you get too greedy, then there would be a big pushback. So moderate your stances, understand the kind of power grab you people are looking for is not sustainable. People are awake, people are aware. So play a role of moderation, of bringing the view of global business, which is a legitimate view, but don't try to capture political power. This is not going to happen. It will only result in a pushback, which will even be unsustainable for your own power. So be cautious.
My message wouldn't be to Davos 2021. In fact, I don't think I'm in a position to give anybody messages. I would make a plea to all our activist friends and our people in government, parliamentarians, the civil servants, even the politicians. So my plea is that let's work as people with the governance structures that are accountable to us, so that we reclaim the space and we let Davos go and become whatever they want to do. And we have fewer and fewer people who want to go to Davos, because I'm not going to go there and compromise my country by signing on to a declaration that later on gets me into trouble. Because politicians can come and go. These rules are staying there forever.
I think it's relevant to say what is the message to Davos 21 in this context of pandemia. And I would say, as you come to try to think of that reset, think of it in terms of how do you make a care system possible? Revise or think of a system that cares, and think of our common human right to be cared. So I think that brings the real issues of the moment to the table. I don't really think that Davos has an answer to that, but we can tell them, if you don't have an answer to that, the answer will be sought elsewhere and you are becoming irrelevant.
Well, 20 years ago, the movements around the world got together to as a similarly undemocratic process was unfolding in the WTO, to say WTO out of agriculture, that food and agriculture, that which feeds people, that nourishes people, that manages our ecologies, that makes our cultures what they are, should not be in the domain of trade. And these kind of neoliberal trades. I think 20 years later, the WF is trying to do a similar thing with the Great Reset or the Fourth Industrial Revolution. All of that should also get out of agriculture. Food shouldn't be a digital commodity. It should be what it is, which is grown by peasants, bought by fisherfolk, shared amongst communities, grounded in the land, and it's not for the big donors or the big data companies to change that. So that would be my message.
I think that the message to Davos 2021 will be technology is not the answer is people. Do not forget people in your equation. You are very excited with all the technology advancements, and you seem to have forgotten that the key actor that we need to serve and that we need to improve is people, and people have a little say on how this technology is being shaped, and that's a mistake.
My message would be, I want you to view me as a rights holder, not a shareholder and not a stakeholder. I want you to view me as part of a collective of committed people, not as an individual consumer. I want you to not resist the work of the UN Human Rights Council to put in place a binding treaty to address quote unquote crimes of transnational corporations. I want you to never lobby for clauses in trade and investment agreements that supersede human rights or undermine the human rights commitments of the countries with whom you're signing them. You can tell I have a very, very long list. So, but there you go.
Thanks for joining us for this mini-series. Subscribe to the Bot Populi podcast and stay tuned for future series that explore pressing issues in the area of digital justice. This has been episode 4 of the Davos Diaries, a podcast mini-series by Bot Populi. Set up in 2018 by 7 organizations from across the globe, Bot Populi is an alternative media platform that's reframing the conversation on digital justice and critically examining the new contours of our digitalizing world. Bot Populi's founding members are the Latin American Information Agency, Data Justice Lab, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Derechos Digitales, Internet Lab, IT for Change, and the JustNet Coalition. Engage with more of our work on botpopuli.net.